Welcome to the Greater Phoenix Economic Council's CHIPS Act webinar. This is an ongoing series of CHIPS Act webinars to help you and your organization leverage this federal program. This webcast will cover the recent notification of funding opportunities, or NOFO, announced on September 29 for the construction, expansion, or modernization of commercial facilities for semiconductor materials and manufacturing equipment facilities for which the capital investment is under $300 million. The Department of Commerce has highly encouraged applications from a consortium. If you are a semiconductor supply chain company interested in learning more about joining consortium, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or the GPEC team. If you are submitting an application for CHIPS Act funding, GPEC can provide an economic impact analysis to help quantify the impact of your investment, which you can submit as supporting documentation with your statement of interest, pre-application, and application. So thank you to our online viewers for taking the time to watch this briefing. My name is Sean Fogarty, and I'm the Vice President of International Business Development for the Greater Phoenix Economic Council. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. I need to highlight our disclaimer. The information provided on this webinar does not constitute legal advice. Instead, all information, content, and materials available on this webinar and website are for general informational purposes only. Viewers of this webinar should contact their attorney or qualified service providers to obtain advice with respect to CHIPS Act funding and application. Feel free to contact GPEC and we'll be happy to connect you with qualified professionals. The views expressed are those of the individual speakers and their individual capacities. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this webinar are hereby expressly disclaimed. The content is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. Lastly, I encourage you to sign up on the GPEC CHIPS Act resource page to receive updates. Our presenters today are Michael Patterson, Heather Hughes, Brett Johnson, and Troy Galan. Our first speaker is Heather Hughes, an associate of Spencer Fane's Kansas City, Missouri office. She is a member of the Corporate and Business Transactions Group. Her practice is focused on corporate law, including mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, securities, and tax law. Mike Patterson is a partner with Spencer Fane, a firm of 425 attorneys in 22 U.S. cities. He helps businesses navigate corporate, compliance, securities, and transactional matters. He has extensive experience in domestic and international mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, distribution, licensing matters, and market entry strategies. He has recently been working with his team to help multiple companies in the semiconductor industry and its supply chain, whether on CHIPS Act compliance, leasing, construction, corporate structuring, technology licensing, workforce and employment, and other issues. I'll go ahead and display the presentation slides, and I'll leave it to Mike and Heather to take it away.
Okay, so this presentation is on the notice of funding for the notice of funding opportunity that was released September 29th, 2023. Next slide, please. So this notice of funding opportunity is for commercial facilities for semiconductor materials and manufacturing equipment facilities for which the capital investment falls below $300 million. Next slide, please. A quick review of the CHIPS Act program objectives. The objectives are to strengthen the security and resilience of the semiconductor supply chain, to provide a supply of secure semiconductors relevant for national security, strengthen the leadership of the United States in semiconductor technology, to grow the economy of the United States and to support job creation in the United States, to bolster the semiconductor and skilled technical workforces in the United States, to promote the inclusion of economically disadvantaged individuals and small businesses, and to improve the resilience of the semiconductor supply chain. Next slide, please. So the key dates for this NOFO. The concept plans will be accepted between December 1st, 2023 and February 1st, 2024. This is a two-step process. There's a concept plan process, and then the later date will be the application date. This is to be determined. The concept plans that are invited to submit an application will be communicated with by the department individually to determine the later application dates. However, applicants that are not picked to go on to the next application phase will be eliminated from consideration. And once eliminated, the applicant cannot submit any more applications for the same project. Next slide, please. The department has set aside $500 million for this notice of funding. Most direct funding awards will equal 10% of the project capital expenditures. In rare cases, the applicants may receive either 20 to 30% of the project capital expenditures, but the direct funding awards will not exceed 30% of the capital expenditures. Next slide, please. This NOFO is different than the previous ones that were submitted just because there is no pre-application phase. In this NOFO, there is a concept plan that is required to be submitted, and the department will review the concept plans and invite those most likely to receive funding to move on to the full application phase. And for the concept plan, it should be no longer than 15 pages, and it should include a description of the project, an applicant profile, so a description of the applicant, where the headquarters are located, the owners of the applicant. It should include the CHIPS incentives justification, so a summary of how the incentives will incentivize the applicant to improve their facility, the economic and national security of this funding, the commercial viability for the applicant, the project feasibility and readiness, and the availability of funds. Next slide.
Mike Patterson picking up here. Thank you, Heather, for talking to us about the concept plan. Key element of this NOFO is we're going to be talking about a number of C's here. The concept plan, which is different from the prior NOFO applications. The criteria we'll go through. And then this NOFO is clearly focused on suggesting how are you going to benefit the cluster in your regional area, and also are you part of a consortium that's going to increase your success and make that happen. So we've had this definition up from the beginning: commercial facilities for materials used to manufacture semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, provided the capital falls below the 300 million. We had and this is to distinguish from the prior NOFO that was for projects above 300 million. The monetary piece of this is 10 to 30%. The prior NOFOs were discussed 15%, and then potential lending of up to and other types of credit up to a 35% threshold, then tax credit financing, etc. This one is clearly focused on 10% in most cases and up to 20 or 30 in rare cases for a better justification. Next slide. We're going to talk about the application review and and the criteria. As Heather mentioned, this is a two-step process. You get a concept plan, and I want to mention that window is very short between December and the February dates that she described there. That's a very short window. It's not open-ended beyond that, whether they would accept one after that. But this is between December 1 and February 1. So you're going to put together a concept plan, no more than 15 pages, cover all those categories that she mentioned, the 7 categories. And the bottom 3 of those categories are, can you really pull it off? Is really the key to those. Yes, national security, which Troy and Brett will address more in greater detail, and which is mentioned a lot. And do you meet the criteria of the overall program that the Department of Commerce the CHIPS is trying to accomplish here. At the full application phase, the review will be qualitative and based upon an assessment of projects against evaluation criteria and application of selection factors, which have been detailed here, but also in the prior NOFOs as well. Next slide, please. There's the upfront decision after they get all the concept plans in, and they're going to score them, and they're going to look at, once they've received other people's concept plans. As Sean mentioned, this is a competitive process. The evaluation criteria is going to give 40 points to the extent to which the project advances U.S. economic and national security concerns. Remember, the overall purpose of this program, as Heather detailed in the first slides, is the U.S. is concerned that we are at risk as a nation because we've allowed our semiconductor industry to get offshore. So that is, hitting those points is really important. Long-term commercial viability. Can you really pull it off? Does the project have legs? The strength and plausibility of your justification, why the incentive is necessary for you to do this. Do you really need this CHIPS funding in order to get your plant or your facility constructed? The likelihood that you'll successfully execute is 15 points, and the availability of non-CHIPS funding sources for the project. Next slide. So what the last ones are looking at is there's an extreme focus here on, particularly since we're below the $300 million threshold, and we're dealing with, if you will, smaller, although 300 million isn't small to me, in comparison with the larger ones that they've already received applications for. Do you have the legs to get it done? And the selection factors are the mix and breadth of your strategic objectives at the project or portfolio level, the likelihood you would proceed in a substantially similar form without the CHIPS funding. Again, asking, do you really need this money? Show us you do. And the extent to which the project's risk profile impacts the program's overall portfolio risk profile, and the extent to which it meaningfully contributes to the development or sustainability of a U.S. fab cluster. Next slide. We're going to see later, and I'm going to have slides on talking about what a consortium is, and whether, and then also distinguishing that from a cluster. But are you helping in your region with your cluster? The extent to which this duplicates other projects funded by the department or other federal agencies, it is to your advantage to distinguish why what you're proposing is obviously a niche that meets a hole in the semiconductor supply chain, and bringing it home to the United States. Whether you're a member of consortium that has a strategic vision that advances the policies of the program, and whether you have in this project have previously received financial assistance in this program, in the government's program that maybe in another building that you're working on, and the extent to which awards in the program contribute to a diversified portfolio and the geographic location of other awards being given support. For consortium applicants, whether the consortium has maximized inclusion of resources from relevant stakeholders, state, local governments, and I'm going to list a number of others. Do you have other incentives? Have you gone to our Commerce Authority? Have you used the other players in the industry? Next slide, please. You can apply for funding as a part of a consortium. Let's talk about what a consortia are. You can leverage connections with entities seeking to build sustain regional semiconductor clusters. This is not the first time that the word cluster has come up. From the very beginning of the NOFO number 1 and the second one, and then the opening above 300 million, there was this word cluster has been used over and over, and I've been recommending to my client, spruce up your statement of interest and your pre-app when you get there, to use that word cluster and show how you are contributing to the cluster. And it will be awarded on a per project basis to the members proposing to construct it, expand or modernize a facility. Those are the eligibilities. But later in a slide, I'll show that there will be awarded to the various members depending on their contribution. Okay, a consortium seeking funding for multiple projects needs to submit a separate application for each project, and not just have 9 projects within a consortium's a project that they send the concept plan for. They need a separate concept plan if you're going to do multiple projects. Okay, the facility that would be submitting the application is the for-profit entity that will own and operate. I'll show in a later slide, it is not necessary to have an umbrella entity that includes all of the consortium members. You can have just the applicant being the for-profit entity, but then also submit a consortium narrative detailing the other members of the consortium, how they contribute. Next slide. This is a key slide to look at here on what the department said they expect a strong consortium, or a consortium will include at least 2 suppliers, a state or local government entity, which can include quasi-governmental entities. In our region, that would be the Arizona Commerce Authority, and we are going to strongly recommend, if you decide to do a consortium, that you have GPEC refer you to the Arizona Commerce Authority, which has already set up a semiconductor task force. I'm a member of that. Several on this presentation are as well. We're attending meetings. The Commerce Authority is leading us to talk about cluster-wide, if you will, needs and where the spots are. And we would anticipate that the Commerce Authority would help us take the lead, or help any of you that wanted to get into a part of a consortium to make an application that would help with the leadership on that. And they suggest an anchor institution such as the semiconductor fab. Well, there are 2 large ones in our region. While they make no advanced commitment, and that would be on a case-by-case basis, it's no secret that they would love to have their supply chain close to them and strong, and covering all of the holes, right? Not just this one, that one, the other, but all of the things that they depend on and rely on, machinery, raw materials, everything, to be in close proximity. Other members, this is significant that they mentioned other members that might be included in a consortium, would be a workforce training provider and labor units. Of course, that is a tremendous priority for the administration. In the prior NOFOs, they've expected that there be substantial discussion in an application about how you're utilizing certain aspects of labor and other workforce support and training. Economic development corporations, institutions of higher education, philanthropic foundations, industry organizations, tech hubs, or other relevant entities. Within our jurisdiction, there are a dozen of these or more that are very interested in the chips and in the semiconductor growth in our region. And it would make a lot of sense to do some broad thinking if you're creating a consortium of who else might be a part of this to make a stronger application. Next slide. They do not need to have an umbrella organization. That you don't need to get them all to legally be a part of. It can be the for-profit entity that is, they do expect the for-profit entity that is going to own or operate the facility to be built. However, you do this, you detail the relationship of each member and their contribution, and show that they align on the mission and the content of each application. So they do need to be a participant. Can't just mention them in a vacuum, okay? And they will consider the extent to which their strategic vision of the consortium advances the economic and national security priorities of the CHIPS Act. And the extent to which a given project is necessary for achieving that vision. And then they're also asking the question, do you really need our CHIPS money? So yes, you do need to show that your project is incentivized by the CHIPS Act. It needs it. And they're asking consortia to be selective in choosing projects. They're trying to discourage, I guess, particular regions just from submitting dozens and dozens of projects but picking the ones that are key to the sustainability of a cluster. Next slide. And that's it. I guess before I turn over to Brett and Troy, I'd just like to say that you need to think about, is this the right one for me? Is this, as opposed to the other NOFOs that have come out, is this the right one for me? There's a huge advantage here in that you can put together a 15-page, very quick concept plan and get a response probably very quickly this spring, and move on to a final application on this basis. However, there's quite a bit to be put into that 15 pages, and the formation of a consortium is advised, is encouraged, and so there's a lot of thought to be put into this, but it is a very different model from the prior.
Thank you very much, Mike and Heather, for that very insightful presentation. Our next speakers are Brett Johnson and Troy Galan. I will let them now share their screen, but before they begin, I'll just give a brief introduction. Brett Johnson is a partner with Snell and Wilmer, where he represents businesses and individuals in government relations matters. His practice includes government regulatory compliance, export and import controls, government contracting, and political law. Troy Galan is an associate with Snell and Wilmer, where he represents publicly and privately held companies, as well as government agencies analyzing international trade and sanctions compliance activity, including risk assessments, due diligence, export licensing, import duties, and potential violations. Brett, Troy, take it away.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome, everybody. Thank you also, Mike and Heather. Real quick, we're going to get a little bit more into a little bit more of the specifics of the CHIPS Act, kind of build on what Mike and Heather have put together. Next slide, please. In particular, we want to talk about the specific eligibility underneath NOFO. And again, there might be some overlap with some of the other NOFOs. You got to be careful about that. Not that you can't be part of different consortiums, et cetera, but it's really one application for the various items. So one thing on the specific eligibility is the material facilities. It's a very broad standard, some of the items that Mike had talked about before, but it's manufacture, production of materials used to manufacture semiconductors. And again, the chemicals, the gases, some of the supply chain, the materials that are actually going to be put into the semiconductors. And although quite broad, keep in mind the items that Mike talked about and Heather, as well as what Troy is going to talk about, because there's actually still a narrow perspective. So although there might be a chemical or a gas that is leading into a product, it's going to have leverage some of the other specific issues, most notably around national security, that will make it a more applicable or more favorable application. That goes also for the manufacturing equipment. It's anything that's a physical production of specialized equipment that's integral to the manufacturing of semiconductor, which includes the subsystems. So you want to be thinking broadly about the manufacturing of equipment. In this context, kind of hand in hand with the national security material or items that Troy is going to talk about, keep that in mind, especially if you are bringing some of this manufacturing back from overseas, in particular China, or it is in the development of new R&D or the next level of manufacturing equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, as Heather talked about, the cap is really $300 million. So you obviously want to make sure that you're underneath that. The base is $20 million in minimum capital investment. However, that's a soft $20 million. If you're able to make a good argument as to underneath $20 million, like almost there, then possibly keep that in mind. But as Mike reiterated several times, is the concept of consortium. So that means that you can piecemeal, if your project is $5 million and another person or another entity that's on the consortium is also $5 million, you can collectively bring those projects together as one synergy and under one program underneath a consortium type model and apply for together above the $20 million. And that's only going to make your application that much better. Again, you must demonstrate the sufficient scale to meaningfully contribute to the priorities. The capital investment that we're referencing here is the 30 million and 20 million. That's inclusive of federal funding. That's inclusive of all the funding sources. So if you're getting other incentives from the state or from the county or the education universities are adding money, that's all included into the ultimate ultimate project. Again, you want to consider partnering with other stakeholders in this area to ensure you're meeting that funding eligibility and maximizing that capital investment number. Next slide, please. Okay, obviously, we talk about the priorities. So the other eligibility requirements, some of these are repeated themes that Mike had talked about before, but again, must be a covered entity, must be a private or consortia of private and public entities. Again, in our experience and based off of what we have discussed with the government officials, is that consortiums are going to be heavily concentrated in this area. So even if you have a great project that is above the $20 million, to maximize your application, you may still want to consider working with others. The easiest one is in regard to university investment. So you're coming up with a project to develop the equipment. There's an R&D piece that would be most appropriate over at a university, and that's their program. Combining forces and combining the project scope is only going to help you in your application. Again, this is meant to incentivize investment. Under no circumstances is going to pay for all of it. So you're going to have to be able to show those capital abilities in yourself, also with the local investment from the state or other governmental entities, to be able to come up with the amount of money. You have to be able to show that you're going to be able to meet your piece of the pie. Again, the documented interest is going to be very important. That's separate than the consortium concept that we're talking about. The consortium concept is that people are bringing their various projects and bringing them together to create the consortium. The documented interest is different. That is what Mike was talking about with the Arizona Commerce Authority providing a letter of support, as well as showing the economic incentives that you may qualify for, whether it's with the Competes grant, whether it's with some of the tax credits, and really having that language in the ACA's letter that of what the incentives you would qualify for being in Arizona, or if you're in a different state, what those states are going to be able to provide, and really drawing that back to CHIPS Act compliance. Having regional education training and institutions is key. It doesn't have to be one of the great universities that we have within Arizona. It can be some of the community colleges, which we're seeing quite a bit of getting involved in this space because they're providing that training, that technical support, and then it basically piggybacks onto the project itself. having a clear executable plan that is likely to succeed is very important. Obviously, you have space requirements within the application, but trying to articulate what that plan would be is very, very important. And again, understanding the workforce needs and the plan to meet your workforce needs is going to be important. And then again, I reference the community colleges for support there. Next slide, please. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Troy, who's going to talk about these NOFO priorities.
Perfect. Thank you, Brett. So as every previous NOFO that we have seen before, the department has outlined its priorities as to what it is looking for. It is very important that applicants prepare the applications with these priorities in mind. As opposed to previous NOFOs, and as Mike has discussed before, this is a two-phase application process, and not all applicants will be invited to apply for the second phase. That's why these priorities are so important for applicants. The department has also noted that applicants that do not meet these priorities will not receive funding, and that is true for this NOFO and every other NOFO that we have previously discussed. So what are the priorities? There are 6 different priorities that the department has outlined, but again, there are 2 that are the most important ones. Those are the 2 that will carry the most of the weight in the review process, and those are economic security and national security. The remaining ones as well will be considered. However, if an application does not meet the department's economic or national security goals, the remaining basis for the department's application review will not be able to compensate for not meeting the number 1 and number 2 that we have listed here. Next slide, please. For economic security, we will also discuss the R&D requirements. This NOFO is different than the previous ones, in which the department had previously indicated that applicants would be required to contribute to the R&D, to the research and development in the United States. However, this NOFO actually indicates what the specific programs are. All these programs are funded under the CHIPS Act, and those are listed here. Among those are the National Semiconductor Technology Center, the NSTC, the National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program, the NAPMP, and the Manufacturing USA Institutes, which have not been established yet, and the CHIPS Metrology Program, which again, even though it's funded by the CHIPS Act, it has not been established. We will discuss in a minute the different ways that applicants will be asked to contribute to these programs, but one question that has come up is whether previous applicants under other NOFOs or future NOFOs will also be subject to these requirements. And the answer is yes. We just expect that applicants that are already going through the process will be asked to make these commitments at a later stage. Next slide, please. Those specific R&D requirements. So among the things that the Department of Commerce will expect applicants to commit in exchange of getting funding is rotating some of their staff to the NSTC, providing training through exchanges, meaning that some of the NSTC staff may come to your facility and learn through your process, and you will also be able to send your staff to NSTC facilities and NA and PMP facilities to be able to learn cutting-edge technology. The department, to some degree, will ask that you provide access to your existing R&D facilities for their research programs. That may be in the form of letting you use a specific machine or a specific process that you may have and the government currently does not have access to. Other ways to contribute will be to donate funds, of course, but also equipment, perhaps equipment that has been replaced. Instead of throwing out, the department will ask that it'll be donated to the government for research projects. And of course, participating in the Department of Defense Microelectronics Commons, which is again also funded under the CHIPS Act, and it's basically for military purposes development of semiconductors. Some of the things that applicants should consider when agreeing or pushing back against these requirements are whether any IP rights will be transferred to the government as part of these exchanges, ensure that there's no solicitation of employees. Again, through those exchanges, when some of your employees are going to government facilities, and to the extent that they're going to facilities of other members of the consortium, you want to discuss those no solicitation of employees. And then also access to supply chains. The government will be interested in tapping into the specific supply chain. So making sure that these programs, these R&D requirements does not affect your ongoing programs and supply chain efforts are items that should be considered. Next slide, please. National security, that is our second priority that we mentioned before, that is very important for the Department of Commerce. And again, the big thing here is the department is looking to onshore suppliers to the United States. They're looking to create a robust and secure domestic supply chain. And again, for those applicants that are already in the United States, that will translate into having those suppliers closer to the fabrication facilities for semiconductors. So how do you demonstrate in your application that the specific project you're seeking funding for meets this national security priority? First, applicants should look at any programs or any platforms that the project will support. So to the extent that you're already a government contractor for a Department of Defense or any other national security programs, you want to ensure that your application highlights those items. If you're a small supplier or you simply have not participated in any national security programs in the past, we would suggest that you look at sam.gov. That's where the government lists RFQs for different programs. Look at the Department of Defense, look at other national security agencies' requirements, and see if the equipment, the materials that you're manufacturing are able to meet any of those requirements. And even if you're not already participating, it would make sense to know that you would be able to fulfill those requirements. Also, look at your customer base or your existing customer base, even if you're specifically not supplying the Department of Defense or again these national security programs. Consider whether any of your customers, anybody that you're providing these materials or equipment to, are already helping the government participating in those programs, and you can mention those in your applications, as I mentioned before. Also, getting those letters from your customers noting that you're participating in these programs would be very helpful to meet this requirement. Finally, something that the Department of Commerce will note highly and really facilitate your application is identifying any government points of contact to validate that the specific project you're citing as helping national security does in fact help national security. Again, those people could be procurement officers, program managers, and similarly, if you're not participating directly in these programs, maybe one of your downstream customers would be able to help obtaining this letter in a program that you have participated in with materials or with equipment in the past. Next slide, please. Other considerations to meet this national security priority is that the department wants to ensure that its funds will be protected, that the project that they're funding will be protected. There has been an increased concern of malicious disruptions of our semiconductor facilities in the United States and also abroad. And of course, a vulnerable area that they want to address are the supply chain, which is the purpose of this novel. Here, applicants want to identify those established safeguards that addresses the Department of Commerce's concerns in this regard. They're concerned for stealing, compromising, altering, or destroying any sensitive information. And something important to mention here is that these safeguards have to be already established. So if you already have them, make sure that you identify those safeguards and indicate them in your application. To the extent that they're not fully developed, this would be a good time to go ahead and building out those processes and procedures to address these concerns. You do not want to wait until a later stage of the application process when the department notes that you don't have developed safeguards, or you simply don't have them and therefore they're not willing to give you the funding that you are requesting. And you want to concentrate on the protection of IP. That has been a big concern to the extent that you have fought in the past any IP rights, enforce your rights abroad in places specifically like China. The department will be very interested in that history. They want to make sure there's no counterfeiting of your products and similar security issues as well. And the big one here would be cybersecurity risk. So make sure that you have a well-established cybersecurity practice and procedures, that your computers have those firewalls that the government usually requires when you submit governmental bids. At a higher level, some of the examples of things that you may want to indicate are that supply chain mapping. And here for supply chain applicants, that would be where do your raw materials come from? Is there a risk that your supply chain would be disrupted by geopolitical events? And if so, what steps have you taken to mitigate that risk, or what steps are you proposing to take to mitigate those risks? Specifically, make sure that you look at those locations that will be subject to geopolitical instability, and look upstream and downstream as well. Even if you have a secure supply chain mapping going on, you also want to address whether your customers have also those protections and how you will be able to serve their needs in case of any of these disruptions that are mentioned here. Next slide, please. The other priorities, as we mentioned, the two that we just discussed, economic security and national security, are the most important ones. The rest of them are very similar to what we have discussed in our previous NOFAs. If you want specific details about these additional priorities, please go ahead and look at our previous CHIPS Act webinars. However, there are some small nuggets that we did find that are different for these priorities in the supply chain NOFA, so we will discuss them here. For commercial viability, at a high level, the department wants to make sure that the project that they're funding will be able to operate and is commercially viable. Specifically for the supply chain NOFO, you want to explain where your equipment is used in the actual manufacturing of semiconductors. If you produce a specific gas, a specific chemical, if you create a specific machine, you want to indicate clearly and at a high level where you fall in that supply chain line. A big reminder is some of the applications that we have seen are very technical, very nitty-gritty. And again, just a reminder that the people that are staffing the CHIPS Act office personnel, they have financial backgrounds, they're investment bankers, and they may not be as familiar with your specific supply chain aspect that you may be proposing. So make sure that you really disclose that and explain it in a way that everyone can understand. In terms of financial strength, this is a repeated theme from what we have seen before, and it has mentioned throughout this presentation. You must maximize your use of private sector contributions. The department wants to use CHIPS Act funds efficiently, and they're not going to be funding projects that could be seeking funds from other places. And those other places also include from related entities. And to the extent that you are a subsidiary from a larger business, you'll have to explain why you're unable to get those funds from a parent company that may be larger and have the ability to fund the specific project that you're seeking funds for. In terms of technical feasibility and readiness, the big change here is it's an administration priority. The Department of Commerce wants to see that the project, that the facility that they will be funding will be able to be resilient from weather and climate-related risk. Some of the ways that we've addressed it before is by looking at the FEMA flood plans and explaining why the facility is outside those high-risk areas, or to the extent that it is in those risk areas, what steps, whether the community or the state level have taken to prevent flooding or any other natural disasters that may put at jeopardy that investment that the government is engaging in. Finally, the workforce and community investment. Again, we have large explanations on what this entails. There's no specific requirement for the supply chain NOFO, so please we'll refer you to our previous presentations. Next slide, please. For compliance requirements, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Brett.
Thank you, Troy. And obviously, we're going to talk a little bit more about the national security guardrails, but going back to one of the slides that Troy was talking about, the national security on the cyber security, that's going to be a very, very important element of anybody's application. So I would recommend that you look at the government contracting requirements in this area, most notably the NIST requirements for cybersecurity and the FedRAMP program. Those take a long time to come up to speed. There's a significant amount of check marks that have to be gone through for your IT systems to ensure cybersecurity. So if you're going to be part of this application process, I would strongly recommend that you're either FedRAMP certified or approved, or that you're well on the way and making note of that, because again, for the national security aspect, it's going to be very important. Although there has been quite a bit of talk over the last few weeks about not divorcing China, hey, can we work together as we move forward as friendly competitors? The reality is that the policy of the United States, especially around the CHIPS Act, is decoupling the semiconductor industry in the United States from China. So there is this prohibition inside the NOFO and part of the application process that you will not expand your semiconductor capacity in the foreign countries of concern, most notably China, for 10 years post taking the money. You are allowed to maintain your facilities abroad, but basically it only allows for a minuscule de minimis expansion of 5% during that entire period of time. So you have to be very careful about that, as well as not trying to get around the system or the requirements on that. And it's going to be interesting how the government plans on auditing it. Obviously, it's going to be through certifications primarily. But if you do expand or increase your presence in China and the government finds out about it and you've taken this money, it could lead to a false claim. And you want to be very, very careful in that context and have understanding the operational people in China are also working with the operational people in the United States to ensure that there is not an increase in production there. It also leads to the restriction on joint research and technology licensing in those foreign entities of concern. Of course, this is one of the major issues that led to the trade war with China in the first place, which was Chinese requirements under their law to share certain technologies or share certain developments with either the Chinese government or Chinese-owned entities. So that really undermines possibly some existing contracts that exist in regard to operations for China. And you basically may have to pick and choose whether or not you want to comply with your existing contractual terms with your Chinese partners or take this money and these opportunities here in the United States. Of course, there's always the devil's in the details, and there are some excluded activities that you may want to consider as being exceptions. One thing for sure is have very good policies and procedures in place about this area. Next slide, please. We talked earlier, we've talked quite a bit about in this presentation about consortiums but how does that deal with confidential information? Okay. One thing when we're dealing with these issues, especially in informal consortiums that might not have the formal arrangement of an entity that's kind of coordinating everything, is how do you handle confidential information and trade secrets and proprietary data? Now, the CHIPS Act is not requiring you to share any of that confidential information, but I'll point you back to one of Troy's earlier slides on the R&D requirements and what to expect. And it's talking about access to facilities, it's talking about joint training, it's talking about other types of access to equipment and design tools. Those can all be considered proprietary. And so how do you walk that basically fine line in ensuring that you're going to have your information protected amongst the consortium and amongst your partners? Again, that's going to be the devil's in the details. It's going to be the internal agreements between the consortium partners. I can tell you that if your consortium partner includes one of the major universities, they are very, very strict on their own confidentiality provisions, very shifted towards the universities. And then also because they're universities, about the development of technology and ideas in the public sphere. Now, of course, universities are some of the best IP protections entities in the world, and that if they create something, they want the patent, they want the trade secret associated with that. But in regard to ideas and the flourishing of new developments in different areas, they want to be able to make that public through papers, etc. That might not actually fit your mold, and especially when you're working with them. So you're going to really have to understand the fine print of those agreements and go in with your eyes open. Again, having that discussion on the front end versus the back end of these types of transaction is absolutely vital. In regard to the material you're sharing with the Department of Commerce, is that if it is confidential information, and we are pretty aggressive as to what's confidential information, ensure that it is marked appropriately. And then if you get a request from the Department of Commerce as that, hey, we've received a FOIA request for your information, don't just sit on that. There's a short period of time that you need to respond, and you need to reassert your rights underneath FOIA, usually 12B4 or B4 and B6, as to reasons why you want your information to be protected as trade secrets, proprietary information, or in regard to protecting your people about privacy information. So again, make sure the markings are correct. Next slide, please. We're going to talk just real briefly about tech hubs. This is the most recent authorization by the Department of Commerce has put out at the end of September about authorized tech hubs. One of them, very good, is obviously here in the state of Arizona. The strategy was a strategy development grant, which is a medical device manufacturer multiplier strategy development consortium. Now, GPEC is significantly involved in this, and basically will have a lot of opportunities as part of one of the phase 1 awardees. It's basically, how are we going to integrate it? How are we going to make this happen? So the great thing is that there may be the opportunity to have further tech hub designations. Okay, you are able to add and remove members between phase 1 and phase 2. So if you're interested, if this is your space, make sure you're contacting GPEC about it. But the first phase is really trying to get the coordination down and then following it up. Whether or not that is a formal arrangement or is yet to be seen. Furthermore, there's nothing that says that a current tech hub could not be expanded for purposes of other NOFOs and other opportunities underneath the CHIPS Act. So stay tuned for that too. But again, as this whole presentation has been about, watching and for those opportunities amongst the consortiums and partnerships with other entities is going to be key to accessing this funding. So with that, last slide. So again, a little bit more about the GPEC. Again, the purpose of this one is the artificial intelligence, the machine learning technologies, domestic manufacturing productions. We've listed several of the entities that are here. Again, I'm sure you're not surprised about some of the partners of interest here, though. The government entities, obviously Phoenix is a major one. Maricopa County is a natural one, but you see Chandler and some of the other individual cities are really taking a leading effort in this area, collaboratively within the region for sure. But if your facility is going to be based in Scottsdale or Chandler or Glendale, is bringing in that city as part of the team is very important to show that local interest, especially as the CHIPS Act is trying to diversify this money across the region. Finally, the philanthropies are also important, nonprofit or non-governmental groups in this area. Next slide, please. And with that, that's all we have. And I'll turn it back over to Sean.
Well, thank you very much, Brett and Troy, for the comprehensive presentation. As we wrap up, I would like to ask Mike or Brett if you have any final remarks.
I do, and then I'll turn it to Brett again. But big focus here. Don't miss the focus that this is a short window for this concept plan to be filed between December the 1st and February the 1st. So we're talking about a 60-day window, and we're talking about December the 1st is only 30 days away from tomorrow. So if you plan to do this concept plan, it's only 15 pages, but there's a lot to do to get that 15 pages together. As we've described for an hour today, the priorities, but the 7 different categories that need to be in this 15 pages: your project, your profile, your justification, economic national security, commercial viability, project feasibility, readiness. Can you really get it done? But then availability of funds, as Brett mentioned as well. This doesn't pay for the whole thing. It's only 10 to 30%. And you've got to figure out and show them where is the other money going to come from to pay for your project. I strongly recommend, since there's a strong recommendation to show how you benefit the cluster in our area, the region, but also considering forming a consortium and a lot of people on that list that could be part of your consortium. I strongly recommend that you get you in contact with Sean here and have GPEC refer you to the Arizona Commerce Authority and the universities, as Brad has mentioned. Get on the semiconductor task force at the Arizona Commerce Authority and take Sean up on that free economic analysis to utilize in your plan and in your presentation to CHIPS. And also, you really need to be showing a unique niche for this NOFO. You need to be showing why you are in a spot that is really needed and that there's a hole here in the supply chain. And if we don't produce this, then it will not exist bringing this back from China. So that's what I have. Brett?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And I obviously reiterate the time frame is very short, and you'll be surprised as you start putting together. You're going to have, you know, probably 100 pages could be of material. And trying to limit that down to the 15 pages that Mike's talking about is very important. But also using the language that the Department of Commerce has put in the NOFOs and other regulations, because these are fine, as Troy mentioned, these are financial analysts who are reviewing this. This is not necessarily a lot of technical people, and using their own language in the application is only going to make your application stronger. The other thing is, I'll be honest with you, is before just rolling the dice and putting in the application, and trying to just cobble something together real quick due to the short time frames, I do think you might want to take a pause and look at your business enterprise, look at your partners, look at what you're able to do, and whether or not you want to expend the significant amount of resources to try to pursue this. If you're not going to be able to put your best foot forward, because again, it is a lot of work. My last point is that looking at the consortium partners, and I meant to mention this earlier, is all the consortium partners that we have mentioned here, the universities, the Commerce Authority, they're going to be part of a lot of different opportunities here. So to the extent that you're able to identify other groups that are not necessarily part of those consortiums to add to yours, not that I obviously strongly encourage getting the universities on board, but you need to have proponents of your program and concentrating on yours. So if you're a large university and you're part of a lot of different consortiums, or you're looking for your own individual funding, it might be a little bit more difficult for that entity or a big, large entity to be able to promote your project with the various stakeholders if they have so many different projects that are out there. So obviously be overly inclusive, but also identifying people who are unique for you and can basically be an advocate for you as a good stakeholder. So with that, turn it back over to Sean.
Well, thank you again, Brett and Mike. Hopefully this webinar will spark an interest among our viewers to learn more about the CHIPS Act and how your company can apply for it. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Commerce recently announced over 500 companies submitted their statement of interest. So it's going to be very competitive. Again, we encourage all firms to engage with qualified professionals to assist with your CHIPS Act funding opportunities and applications. And please contact GPEC if you have any questions or need introductions to service providers. Our services are free of charge. In addition, I would like to also point out that we do have a CHIPS Act resource page, and I would encourage you to go to our website, and you can subscribe to our website and receive the latest updates to our CHIPS and Science Act webpage here, which will essentially curate and provide updates on the latest NOFOs and notifications of opportunities for members. In addition, for companies that are planning to submit an application, as Brett highlighted and Mike reiterated, GPEC can also provide an economic impact analysis that can help you quantify the direct and indirect jobs impact of your project. Finally, thank you, Mike, Heather, Brett, and Troy for sharing your insights on the CHIPS Act application and the latest NOFO. We appreciate the support from Spencer Fane and Snell and Wilmer. And we'd like to thank you all, to our viewers, for joining us today. We hope you found the discussion informative and valuable. This concludes our program. Thank you.